Hey guys, tonight we're not just drifting off of a lullaby. We're curling up in the shadow of pyramids, surrounded by sand, sarcophagi, and yes, cheese. That's right. You're about to drift into dreamland while learning why ancient Egyptians thought your eternal journey needed a wheel of dairy by your side. You trudge through the dry desert air, the sun beating down on your linen robes. The Nile glimmers faintly in the distance, and somewhere nearby, a scribe is etching hieroglyphs into stone. But here, deep within a tomb that smells faintly of honey and decay, there's something unexpected waiting for you. Not gold, not jewels, cheese. Lots of it. And honestly, if you tried to survive in this world without knowing what you were doing, you probably wouldn't make it past the crocodile pits, or the sacred beetles, or even the sunscreen made from crocodile dung. Yes, that was a thing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love imagining all of us drifting off together across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the tomb, torch flickering in your hand. The walls are covered in paintings, scenes of feasts, farming, gods with animal heads. But it's what's on the floor that catches your eye. Jars, pots, some sealed tight, others cracked open, revealing something hardened and crumbly. You lean in. It's not spices. It's not grain. It's cheese. A lot of it. And no, this isn't some elaborate prank pulled by a bored pharaoh. This was standard procedure. In ancient Egypt, when someone died, they weren't just buried, they were provisioned for eternity. And one of the most important items packed for the afterlife? Cheese. Why? Why not wine? Why not bread? Why not meat or figs or beer? Well, those were definitely included too. But cheese? Cheese got special treatment. It was placed carefully, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes stored in clay jars, always meant to last. Historians have found cheese remnants in tombs dating back over 3,000 years. One particularly famous find came from the tomb of Tammuz, an Egyptian high official from the 13th century BCE. Inside, archaeologists uncovered a solidified mass that, after lab analysis, turned out to be cheese, one of the oldest known examples in the world. But how did they make it? What kind of cheese was it? Was it even edible by the time our dearly departed reached the field of reeds? And more importantly, why would anyone think cheese was essential for eternal life? Well, grab your blanket, because we're going to find out together. You keep walking through the tomb, your torch casting long shadows on the walls. The air is thick with dust and time. But outside, just a short walk away, though probably not advisable in bare feet, the Nile River flows like it always has, steady and life-giving. It's morning in ancient Egypt, though you wouldn't know it by the darkness of this tomb. Outside, farmers are already out in the fields, coaxing barley and flax from a fertile black soil left behind by the annual flood. The sun god Ra is rising in his golden boat, bringing light to a land that has thrived for thousands of years. And somewhere nearby, someone is milking a goat. Because yes, milk was a thing here. Not just for drinking, but for turning into something more lasting. Cheese. It might sound odd to us now, burying cheese with the dead. But when you live in a place where food preservation is a daily challenge, you learn to appreciate what lasts. The Egyptians didn't have refrigerators, obviously, or Tupperware. They had clay jars, salt, and sun-dried bricks to work with. And they were clever about it. If you wanted something to last beyond the next harvest, you needed to make it strong enough to survive the heat, the bugs, and the occasional curious jackal. Cheese fit the bill perfectly. And it wasn't just any cheese. It was often a hard, salty kind, something closer to feta than cheddar. Goats and cows provided the milk, and skilled hands turned it into something sturdy enough to endure both feasts and funerals. But why would you pack cheese for the afterlife? Why not just bring beer? Well, you did bring beer. You brought a lot of beer. But cheese? Cheese was valuable. It was portable. It was nutritious. And if you believed in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise, you were going to need something to eat while plowing eternal fields and sipping divine honey. Historians still argue whether these cheeses were meant to be eaten by the dead or used as symbolic offerings to the gods. Some think they were placed there simply to honor tradition. Others believe the departed truly needed sustenance on their journey. Either way, one thing is clear. Cheese was important enough to earn a spot in the tomb. So you stand there, surrounded by history and dairy, wondering how something so simple could become such a big part of life and death in ancient Egypt. You step out of the tomb and into the morning light. The sand is already warm beneath your feet, and ahead of you stretches a land teeming with life. The Nile glimmers like a serpent winding through the desert, its waters feeding fields of grain, orchards heavy with figs, and gardens bursting with onions and leeks. And somewhere in the distance, past the rows of mud-brick homes, you hear the low murmur of voices, market chatter, the clatter of pottery, the occasional bleat of a goat. This is where it all begins. Daily life in ancient Egypt. A world where farmers rose before dawn till the soil, where scribes sat cross-legged on reed mats scratching hieroglyphs into papyrus, and where bakers worked their dough under the watchful eyes of temple priests. It was a society built on routine, order, and the rhythm of the seasons dictated by the great river. And in that rhythm, food played a starring role. Bread, beer, dates, honey, these were the staples of life. But cheese? Cheese was more than just a snack. It was a necessity, a luxury, a survival tool. You make your way toward a market, where vendors are setting up stalls filled with fruits, spices, and baskets of freshly baked flatbreads. The scent of roasting fish drifts from a nearby fire pit, but your nose catches something else. Something tangy, earthy, unmistakably dairy. You follow the smell and find a vendor proudly displaying his wares. Round discs of hardened cheese wrapped in linen cloth, stacked neatly beside jars of thick yogurt. Cheese wasn't just for nobles or pharaohs. It was for everyone, from the highest priest to the humblest farmer. Cheese was a common sight at the dinner table, packed into lunch baskets, and yes, buried with the dead. But how did they make it? Well, imagine this. A pot of fresh milk, left to sit under the hot sun until it curdled. Then add a bit of salt, press the curds into a mold, and let time do the rest. No refrigeration needed. Just patience, heat, and a few hungry microbes. And if you wanted something softer, something creamier, you could strain it through cloth, mix it with herbs, or even age it in clay pots sealed with beeswax. Some cheeses were eaten fresh, others aged for months, turning harder and saltier with time. Either way, they lasted longer than most foods in this blistering climate. Historians still argue whether these cheeses were meant to be enjoyed in the afterlife or simply served as symbolic offerings. Some believe the Egyptians thought the dead could smell and appreciate the presence of food, even if they couldn't eat it. Others think the cheese was there to nourish the soul on its journey beyond death. Either way, one thing is certain. When you live in a place where the sun scorched the earth and food spoiled quickly, having something that lasted, something rich in protein, fat, and flavor, was nothing short of divine. So you take a deep breath, soak in the bustling market sounds, and remind yourself, this isn't just history. This is breakfast. You leave the market behind, your stomach full of flatbread and cheese, and make your way toward a quiet part of town, the necropolis. Here, the air feels heavier, the sun somehow less warm. Tombs line the landscape like silent sentinels, their entrances sealed with stone or hidden beneath layers of sand. This is where life ends, but in ancient Egypt, it's also where the next chapter begins. Death wasn't an end here, it was a transition, a journey. And like any good traveler, you needed supplies. Not just gold or amulets or fancy linen wrappings, but food, real, tangible nourishment for the soul as it made its way through the underworld. Imagine this. You're standing beside a freshly dug tomb, watching as priests chant prayers and family members weep. The body, wrapped tightly in linen, eyes closed forever, is surrounded by jars, baskets, and small statues called shabdi, meant to serve as servants in the afterlife. Among all these offerings, there's something simple yet strangely specific. A wheel of cheese, carefully placed beside the deceased. Why? Because Egyptians believed that death wasn't the final stop. It was more like a long trip, one that required provisions. Just like you pack snacks for a day-long boat ride down the Nile, you pack food for eternity. bread, beer, dried fish, figs, honey, and yes, cheese. And it wasn't just symbolic. The Egyptians weren't ones to rely purely on spiritual gestures. They believed the dead could still feel hunger, thirst, even cold. So they provided real food, real sustenance to help them survive in the afterlife. Some tombs had entire feasts laid out, complete with roasted meats and jugs of wine. Others were simpler, with just a few loaves of bread and a hunk of cheese. But how did they know what the dead would need? Well, they watched the living. If you ate cheese every day, why wouldn't you want it in the next world? If you loved honeyed dates for breakfast, wouldn't you miss them when you crossed over? Historians still argue whether the Egyptians truly believed the dead consumed the food, or if it was more about ritual and symbolism. Some think the offerings were meant to be smelled rather than eaten, like incense, wafting up to the gods and the departed alike. Others believe the soul could absorb the essence of food without physically consuming it. Either way, one thing was clear: you didn't send someone off empty-handed. So as you stand there, watching workers seal the tomb, you realize that this isn't just a burial. It's a picnic for eternity. You step inside another tomb, this one older than the last. The air is thick with dust and time, and as your torch flickers against the stone walls, you realize something strange. This place doesn't look like a final resting place at all. It looks more like storage. Jars line the floor in neat rows, some sealed tight, others cracked open to reveal darkened remnants of food long past its prime. Baskets sit stacked in corners, their woven fibers still intact despite the centuries. And there, beside what was once a sarcophagus, sits a collection of small loaves of bread, hardened into something resembling ancient crackers. But it's not just bread. There are figs, dates, honey cakes, dried fish, jars of oil, and yes, cheese. Lots of it. Some wrapped in cloth, others tucked into clay pots, carefully labeled with hieroglyphs that tell you exactly what they contain. Because in ancient Egypt, tombs weren't just for bodies. They were pantries, storage rooms for eternity. Imagine how much planning went into this. You couldn't just throw together a random assortment of snacks and call it good. No, this was serious business. Every item had to be chosen with care, selected based on what the deceased enjoyed in life and what they might need in the afterlife. Bread for energy, beer for hydration, honey for sweetness, meat for protein, and cheese? Cheese was the ultimate survival food. It didn't spoil quickly. It could last for months, even years, if stored properly. In a land where temperatures soared and refrigeration was non-existent, cheese was the perfect travel companion for the dead. And Egyptians knew this. They packed cheese not just because they liked it, but because they understood its value. It was filling, nutritious, and easy to carry. Exactly what you want when navigating the underworld. Some tombs had entire feasts laid out, complete with roasted ducks, spiced meats, and wine. Others were simpler, filled with just a few loaves of bread, a jug of beer, and a wheel of cheese. But no matter how elaborate or modest the offering, one thing remained constant. Cheese was always there. Historians still argue whether these foods were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply served as symbolic gestures. Some believe the soul could absorb the essence of the food without physically consuming it. Others think the offerings were meant to nourish the Ka, the spiritual double that lived on after death. Either way, one thing is clear. If you want to make it through the afterlife, you needed provisions. And cheese? Cheese was essential. So you kneel beside one of the jars, brushing away a layer of dust, and take a closer look. The cheese inside has hardened over time, but you can still see its shape, round, flat, slightly crumbly. A simple snack, yet somehow it feels sacred. Because in this quiet tomb, surrounded by the echoes of history, cheese isn't just food, it's immortality. You step inside another tomb, this one older than the last. The air is thick with dust and time, and as your torch flickers against the stone walls, you realize something strange. This place doesn't look like a final resting place at all. It looks more like storage. Jars line the floor in neat rows, some sealed tight, others cracked open to reveal darkened remnants of food long past its prime. Baskets sit stacked in corners, their woven fibers still intact despite the centuries. And there, beside what was once a sarcophagus, sits a collection of small loaves of bread, hardened into something resembling ancient crackers. But it's not just bread. There are figs, dates, honey cakes, dried fish, jars of oil, and yes, cheese. Lots of it. Some wrapped in cloth. Others tucked into clay pots. Carefully labeled with hieroglyphs that tell you exactly what they contain. Because in ancient Egypt, tombs weren't just for bodies. They were pantries. Storage rooms for eternity. Imagine how much planning went into this. You couldn't just throw together a random assortment of snacks and call it good. No, this was serious business. Every item had to be chosen with care, selected based on what the deceased enjoyed in life and what they might need in the afterlife. Bread for energy, beer for hydration, honey for sweetness, meat for protein, and cheese? Cheese was the ultimate survival food. It didn't spoil quickly. It could last for months, even years, if stored properly. In a land where temperatures soared and refrigeration was non-existent, cheese was the perfect travel companion for the dead. And Egyptians knew this. They packed cheese not just because they liked it, but because they understood its value. It was filling, nutritious, and easy to carry. Exactly what you want when navigating the underworld. Some tombs had entire feasts laid out, complete with roasted ducks, spiced meats, and wine. Others were simpler, filled with just a few loaves of bread, a jug of beer, and a wheel of cheese. But no matter how elaborate or modest the offering, one thing remained constant. Cheese was always there. Historians still argue whether these foods were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply served as symbolic gestures. Some believe the soul could absorb the essence of the food without physically consuming it. Others think the offerings were meant to nourish the Ka, the spiritual double that lived on after death. Either way, one thing is clear. If you want to make it through the afterlife, you needed provisions. And cheese? Cheese was essential. So you kneel beside one of the jars, brushing away a layer of dust, and take a closer look. The cheese inside is hardened over time, but you can still see its shape, round, flat, slightly crumbly. A simple snack, yet somehow it feels sacred. Because in this quiet tomb, surrounded by the echoes of history, cheese isn't just food, it's immortality. You reach for a small clay pot. Its lid cracked, but still mostly intact. Inside, the remains of what was once fresh milk sit, like a forgotten experiment in time. You can almost see it, thick, white, warm from the udder of goat or cow, poured carefully into this very vessel. The air inside the tomb is dry, thick with dust and history, but you close your eyes and imagine the heat outside, the sun beating down on the fields, the farmers moving slowly through their work, the scent of damp earth and animal fur. This is where it all started. Milk, fresh, warm, and waiting to be transformed. Cheese making in ancient Egypt wasn't complicated, at least not by modern standards. There were no refrigerators, no pasteurization machines, no fancy aging caves carved into mountainsides. Just milk, salt, thyme, and the relentless Egyptian sun. And yet somehow, they made cheese that lasted long enough to survive thousands of years buried in tombs. The process began simply. A farmer would collect milk from a goat, sheep, or cow, most commonly goats, since they thrive in the arid climate better than cows. Then, the milk was poured into a pot or even a stretched animal stomach. Yes, really. And left to sit in the hot sun. Without refrigeration, it didn't take long before the milk began to sour, curdling naturally thanks to wild bacteria in the air. Once the milk had separated into curds and whey, the next step was to drain off the liquid and press the solids into a mold. Sometimes that mold was just a woven basket lined with cloth. Other times, it was a simple wooden frame. Pressure was applied, sometimes by hand, sometimes with stones, and the excess moisture was squeezed out, leaving behind something firm and solid. Then came the salt. Lots of it. Salt wasn't just a flavor enhancer. It was a preservative. In a land where food spoiled quickly, salt was a lifesaver. It kept cheese from molding too fast, helped draw out moisture, and gave the final product that sharp, tangy bite that Egyptians clearly loved. Some cheeses were eaten fresh, soft, and spreadable like modern-day ricotta. Others were pressed harder, aged longer, and turned into something dense and crumbly, closer to feta or parmesan. These harder cheeses were perfect for storage, able to withstand months, even years, without rotting. Historians still argue whether these ancient cheeses were meant to be eaten in the afterlife or simply served as symbolic offerings. Some believe the Egyptians thought the dead could smell and appreciate the presence of food, even if they couldn't consume it. Others think the cheese was there to nourish the soul on its journey beyond death. Either way, one thing is certain. Turning milk into cheese wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. So you set the pot back down, letting the dust settle over once more, and realize that this simple act, curdling milk, pressing curds, salting them until they hardened, was more than just a recipe. It was a ritual, a gift, a promise that even in eternity, you wouldn't go hungry. You pick up another jar, this one slightly larger than the last. The seal is broken, and as you peer inside, you can see the remnants of something crumbly, hardened by centuries of time, but still unmistakably cheese. This one looks different, darker, salter, maybe even a little spiced. You tilt the jar gently, imagining what it must have tasted like when it was first placed here. Sharp? Earthy? Maybe with a hint of cumin or coriander. Because yes, ancient Egyptians didn't just make plain cheese. They seasoned it, flavored it, treated it like more than just sustenance. They treated it like cuisine. Now, imagine sitting at a banquet table in the home of a wealthy Egyptian noble. The air is thick with incense, the flickering light of oil lamps casting soft shadows across painted walls. Servants move quietly through the room, placing platters of roasted duck, honeyed figs, and baskets of warm flatbread on the table. And there, nestled between bowls of lentils and jars of beer, sits a tray of cheeses, each one different from the last. Some are soft, spreadable, mixed with herbs and spices. Others are harder, aged for months under the desert sun, pressed into round discs and stored in linen cloth. A few are even soaked in oil or wrapped in leaves to preserve them longer. Cheese wasn't just a single thing. It was a whole category of food, enjoyed in countless ways depending on your status, your region, and your taste. The pharaohs themselves likely had access to the finest cheeses Egypt had to offer. Richer, softer varieties made from cow's milk were probably reserved for the elite, while the common people relied more on goat's milk cheeses, harder, salter, and easier to store. Some cheeses were even flavored with garlic, onions, or aromatic seeds like fenugreek, giving them a boldness that might surprise modern palates. And then there were the religious offerings. Temples dedicated to gods like Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and motherhood, often received dairy products as sacred gifts. She was associated with cows, fertility, and nurturing, so milk and cheese played an important role in her worship. Priests would leave fresh offerings at her altars, believing that she would accept their devotion through scent alone. Historians still argue whether these cheeses were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply served as symbolic gestures. Some believe the soul could absorb the essence of the food without physically consuming it. Others think the cheese was there to nourish the ka, the spiritual double that lived on after death. Either way, one thing is clear. Cheese wasn't just food. It was culture, status, ritual. So you set the jar back down, letting the dust settle over once more, and realize that this wasn't just a snack for eternity. It was a flavor of forever. You stand beside the body, watching as the final preparations take place. The deceased, once a living, breathing person with tastes and preferences, is now wrapped tightly in linen, their face hidden beneath layers of cloth soaked in resin. Priests chant prayers, invoking the gods to guide the soul safely through the underworld. Family members weep quietly, placing small statues and amulets into the tomb. Shabby workers to serve an eternity, protective charms to ward off evil spirits. And then comes the cheese. Not just any cheese. A carefully chosen wheel, wrapped in fine linen, placed gently beside the mummy's side. It's not random, it's intentional. This was their favorite kind of cheese. Maybe it was soft, spreadable, mixed with herbs. Or maybe it was hard and salty, something that could last for years without spoiling. Either way, it belongs here. Because in ancient Egypt, wrapping a body wasn't just about preservation. It was about preparation. Mummification wasn't just about keeping the body intact. It was about ensuring that the ka, the life force, could recognize its former shell and return to it. Without a properly preserved body, the soul might wander lost, unable to find its way to the afterlife. So every step was done with care. First, The internal organs were removed, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, each placed in canopic jars marked with the heads of protected deities. The heart was left behind, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, the organ that would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the final judgment. Then came the drying process. The body was packed and covered in natron, a natural salt mixture that drew out moisture, preventing decay. Days passed, weeks. The skin hardened, the flesh tightened, and eventually the body was ready for wrapping. Linen strips, sometimes torn from old clothing or temple offerings, were soaked in oils and resins before being wound carefully around the limbs, torso, and head. Each fold was precise, each layer meant to protect and preserve. And all the while, the food offerings were prepared. Bread, beer dates, figs, honey, and yes, cheese. Some were placed directly beside the body, tucked into folds of linen like a final meal. Others were stored in jars, sealed tight to keep them fresh for eternity. Historians still argue whether these foods were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply served as symbolic gestures. Some believe the Egyptians thought the dead could smell and appreciate the presence of food, even if they couldn't consume it. Others think the cheese was there to nourish the soul on its journey beyond death. Either way, one thing is certain. When you live in a world where survival depended on careful planning, you didn't leave anything to chance. Not your body, not your soul, and definitely not your snacks. So you watch as the last strip of linen is tied into place, as the final prayer is whispered into the air. The tomb is nearly full. The offerings are set, and as the workers begin sealing the entrance, you realize something strange. This isn't just a burial. It's a picnic for eternity. You step carefully through the darkened tomb, your torch casting long shadows on the walls. Somewhere nearby, a scorpion skitters across the stone floor, disappearing into a crack as if it knows something you don't. The air is thick with dust and time, but also something else. A faint smell, earthy and old, like damp linen wrapped around something forgotten. This place has been undisturbed for centuries. Or so you thought. But now, standing here, you notice something strange. The jar of cheese you examined earlier, it's cracked open more than before. And there, just barely visible in the flickering light, are footprints. Small, human, definitely not yours. Tomb raiders. Oh, yes, you weren't the first person to sneak into this burial chamber. In ancient Egypt, tombs were filled with treasures, not just gold and jewels, but food, clothing, statues, and yes, cheese. And where there's loot, there are thieves. Imagine this. Hundreds of years after this tomb was sealed, under the cover of darkness, a group of men huddle outside its entrance. They've heard rumors, whispers carried to the desert wind, of riches hidden beneath the sand. They dig, slowly, cautiously, knowing that disturbing the dead could bring the wrath of the gods. But hunger, greed, or desperation pushes them forward. They find the entrance, break through, slip inside. And what do they see? Jars of oil, baskets of bread, dried fish, dates, beer, and cheese. Lots of cheese. Some of it crumbly, hardened by time, but still recognizable. Still edible? Maybe not exactly fresh. But in a land where food was precious, even ancient cheese was better than nothing. Historians still argue whether these grave robbers actually ate the tomb offerings or simply took them to sell later. Some believe that in times of famine or hardship, raiders would break into tombs looking not just for treasure, but for sustenance. Others think the cheese and bread were left behind while the gold and jewelry were stolen. The spiritual consequences of taking sacred food too great. But one thing is certain. Tomb builders knew this would happen, so they tried to stop it. Booby traps were common. Hidden pitfalls, false floors, collapsing ceilings, all designed to keep the greedy at bay. Some tombs even carried curses, warnings carved into stone, threatening divine punishment for those who dare to disturb the dead. Yet, none of it worked forever. So you stand there, surrounded by history and decay, realizing that even in death, Egyptians had to outsmart the living. And somewhere nearby, buried beneath layers of dust and time, the ghost of a cheese-making pharaoh watches silently, wondering when his snacks will finally be safe. You kneel beside the jar, brushing away a layer of dust with careful fingers. The cheese inside has hardened into something dense and crumbly, nothing like the soft round you might spread on bread back home. It's aged, preserved by time and salt, sealed beneath layers of linen or clay meant to protect it from the elements. But now, centuries later, it's not just history, it's science. Because believe it or not, archaeologists don't just dig up ancient cheese for fun. They do it to study it, to analyze it, to understand what people were eating thousands of years ago and how they made it last. Imagine this. A team of researchers in white lab coats, carefully lifting fragments of ancient cheese from a tomb. They wear gloves, handle tools with precision, and seal each sample in sterile containers. This isn't some forgotten relic left to rot. It's a treasure trove of information. One of the most famous discoveries came from the tomb of Ptolemy's, an Egyptian high official who lived around 1300 BCE. Inside, archaeologists found a solidified mass that, after careful analysis, turned out to be cheese, one of the oldest known examples in human history. And when they tested it, they didn't just find traces of milk proteins. They found something else, something surprising, signs of bacteria, ancient bacteria, not just any bacteria. Strains linked to brucellosis, a disease that can cause fever, joint pain, and fatigue. In modern times, it's still a concern, especially in places where unpasteurized dairy is consumed. And here, buried in a tomb for over 3,000 years, was evidence that ancient cheesemakers were working with the same microbes we still deal with today. Historians still argue whether this cheese would have been safe to eat by the standards of the time. Some believe that the high salt content and long aging process would have killed off most harmful bacteria. Others think that foodborne illness was just another risk of life in the ancient world, something people accepted as part of daily survival. And then there's the question of taste. What did ancient Egyptian cheese actually flavor like? Without refrigeration, without modern sterilization techniques, fermentation would have played a big role in shaping its character. Some cheeses may have been tangy, sharp, even slightly sour, like an aged feta or goat cheese left too long in the sun. Others might have been softer, creamier, infused with herbs or spices to mask any off notes. So you sit there, surrounded by jars of ancient dairy, realizing that this isn't just a snack for eternity. It's a window into the past, a lesson in microbiology, a reminder that even in death, cheese tells a story. You sit inside a shaded courtyard, the sun blazing overhead but the thick mud brick walls keeping some of the heat at bay. A servant brings you a small clay dish. Inside, a round of cheese rests beside a handful of dates and a cup of beer. You take a bite, savoring the saltiness, the dryness, the way it clings to your tongue like the desert wind. It's not exactly what you call fresh, but then again, in this climate, nothing really is. Because in ancient Egypt, food preservation wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity, with temperatures routinely hitting 40 degrees Celsius or more. Anything left out too long would spoil within hours. There were no freezers, no refrigerators, no vacuum-sealed plastic bags. Just a relentless sun, the ever-present dust, and the ingenuity of people who had learned to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. So, how did they keep their cheese from turning into a smelly disaster before it could be buried with the dead? Well, they used a few clever tricks. First, they made sure the cheese was as dry and salty as possible. Salt was everywhere in Egypt, not just in the food, but in the very land itself. The Nile Delta produced vast quantities of natural salt, which was used for everything from mummification to food preservation. By pressing salt into the curds, cheesemakers ensured that moisture was drawn out, slowing down bacterial growth and making the cheese last longer. Then there was the power of the sun. Unlike modern cheesemakers who age their wheels in cool caves or temperature-controlled cellars, Egyptians used the desert itself as their drying room. Cheese was pressed into molds, wrapped in cloth, and left to cure under the blistering heat. Some was even stored in sealed jars filled with oil or honey, creating an airtight barrier that kept mold and decay at bay. Others were wrapped in leaves or linen soaked in vinegar, both natural preservatives that helped extend shelf life. And if all else failed, well, you just accepted that things didn't stay fresh forever. Spoilage was part of life. Food rotted, milk soured, cheese aged into something harder, sharper, maybe even a little funky smelling. But in a world where survival depended on resourcefulness, a bit of mold never stopped anyone from eating. Historians still argue whether these cheeses were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply served as symbolic offerings. Some believe the soul could absorb the essence of the food without physically consuming it. Others think the cheese was there to nourish the ka, the spiritual double that lived on after death. Either way, one thing is clear. In a place where the sun could turn milk into curd within hours, cheese wasn't just food. It was endurance, a lesson in patience, a snack built to last. You kneel before a small household altar, the flickering glow of an oil lamp casting soft shadows on the stone figures surrounding you. The air is thick with incense, sweet and smoky, curling toward the ceiling like whispered prayers. Before you sits a modest offering. A few loaves of bread, a jug of beer, a handful of dried figs, and yes, a small round of cheese carefully wrapped in linen. Because in ancient Egypt, food wasn't just for the living. It was for the gods, too. Cheese had its own divine patrons, deities who watched over dairy, fertility, and nourishment. Chief among them was Hathor, goddess of love, music, motherhood, and notably cows. She was often depicted as a woman with cow horns and a sun disk, or even as a full cow herself, standing protectively over her worshippers. Since cows were revered for their milk, it only made sense that Hathor would be closely associated with dairy products. Temples dedicated to her often received offerings of milk, yogurt, and cheese, left not just as sustenance, but as symbols of abundance and divine favor. Then there was Khnum, the ram-headed god of the Nile's source, who was sometimes linked to shepherding and animal husbandry. He was believed to shape human bodies on his potter's wheel, molding souls from clay before sending them into the world. And if he shaped life itself, surely he had a vested interest in the creatures that provided nourishment, including those that gave milk. Even Ra, the mighty sun god, had a connection to dairy. As the bringer of light and warmth, he played a role in the ripening of cheese under the desert sun. Without his heat, milk wouldn't curdle, and curds wouldn't press into something firm and lasting. In a land where survival depended on balance and order, even something as simple as cheese had its place in the cosmic cycle. But what about everyday Egyptians? Did they really believe their favorite cheeses were blessed by the gods? Probably. Religious devotion wasn't just reserved for grand temple ceremonies. It was woven into daily life. Farmers prayed to Hathor for healthy livestock. Mothers offered cheese to household spirits for protection. Even tomb offerings weren't just about feeding the dead. They were about honoring the divine forces that govern life, death, and everything in between. Historians still argue whether these cheese offerings were meant to be consumed literally or spiritually. Some believe the gods accepted the essence of the food through scent alone. Others think the act of offering was more important than the physical item itself. Either way, one thing is clear. In a world where food was sacred, cheese wasn't just a snack. It was worship. You set down the Egyptian cheese and imagine another land, another time. The sun still burns overhead, but now you're not beside the Nile. You're in the rolling hills of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carve life into the desert. Here, too, people made cheese. Not just for food, but for trade, for ritual, for survival. Because while the Egyptians buried cheese with their dead, the Sumerians used it differently. They wrote about it. On clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script, some of the earliest written records of dairy production in human history. Records from as early as 3000 BC describe cheese being offered to gods in temple rituals, stored in large jars, and even taxed by city-state rulers. But how did they make it? Much like the Egyptians, really, milk was left to curdle, then drained and pressed into molds. But instead of salt drying it for eternity, Sumerians often flavored their cheeses with herbs and spices, or soaked them in beer to preserve them longer. Some were soft and spreadable, others hard and crumbly, meant to be broken off in chunks during long journeys across the desert. And if you traveled further west, into the lands of the Greeks and Romans, you'd find something even more familiar. The Greeks loved cheese, so much so that mythology credited its invention to the god Aristeas, son of Apollo, who supposedly taught humans how to make it. They aged it in caves, mixed it with honey and figs, and even used it in athletic training, believing it gave warriors strength. The Romans took it a step further. Cheese became a symbol of empire, carried by soldiers on their long campaigns, traded across vast distances, and even used as currency. Roman cheesemakers perfected techniques that would later influence European varieties like pecorino and parmesan. And unlike the Egyptians, who mostly stuck to goat's milk, the Romans favored cow's milk, producing softer, creamier cheeses that could be eaten fresh or aged for months. But back in Egypt, none of this mattered. Their cheese wasn't meant for conquest or commerce. It was meant for eternity. While other cultures saw cheese as a tool, a commodity, a luxury, the Egyptians saw it as a necessity for the afterlife, a snack for the soul, a comfort for the journey beyond death. Historians still argue whether these differences were purely cultural or if climate played a role. After all, in places with cold winters, cheese could be aged for years. In Egypt's blistering heat, preservation meant salting and drying, not aging in cool caves. Either way, one thing is clear. Wherever there were people, there was cheese. And in Egypt, cheese had one job above all else: to follow you even into the grave. You settle into the darkness of the tomb. Your torch now just a faint ember, its flame long since flickered out. The silence is deep and steady, like the hush of a desert night after the wind has died down. Around you, the air is still, thick with time, heavy with history, soft with dust that has not moved in thousands of years. You can almost hear it settling, ever so gently, on top of the jars, the baskets, the bread, the beer, and the cheese. The wheel beside you is old, so old that its shape has softened, its edges worn smooth by centuries of quiet. It crumbles slightly beneath your fingertips, but still holds together, as if refusing to vanish entirely. This cheese was placed here not for show, not for ceremony alone, but for comfort, for continuity. A final taste of life, carried forward into eternity. And now, as you sit here in the dark, surrounded by offerings meant for another world, you realize something strange. This isn't just about food. It's about memory, about identity, about carrying pieces of yourself beyond death, even if those pieces are as simple as a snack wrapped in linen. Because when someone dies, they don't just leave behind their body. They leave behind what they loved, their favorite drink, their preferred spices, the way they liked their bread baked, or how they took their cheese, soft and spreadable, or hard and salty. And in ancient Egypt, those things mattered, enough to be packed into tombs, enough to be buried beneath the sand, enough to survive long after the people who ate them were gone. Historians still argue whether the dead truly needed these foods, or if they were just symbols meant to honor tradition rather than nourish souls. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the act itself was enough. To remember, to provide, to say, you won't be forgotten. So you lean back against the cool stone wall, letting your breath slow, letting the weight of time settle over you like a warm blanket. Outside, the stars are rising over the Nile, casting silver light across the desert sands. Somewhere far away, a jackal howls. A breeze stirs the tops of date palms. And here, deep underground, the past sleeps quietly beside you. You close your eyes, and somewhere in the endless dark, a piece of cheese rests beside you, not forgotten, just waiting. The silence stretches, soft and deep, like the hush of a world still waking from a long, undisturbed sleep. You feel it now, not just in your ears, but in your bones. The weight of centuries, the hush of eternity, the gentle hum of time passing so slowly it feels like it stopped altogether. You breathe in, slowly, deeply. The air is dry, thick with dust and memory, but somehow comforting, like the scent of old books, or the warmth of sunlight through linen curtains. Around you, nothing moves. Not the cheese beside you, not the bread hardened into stone-like loaves, not the oil sitting still inside its jar. Everything waits, quietly, patiently. And so, do you. Your body feels heavier now, sinking gently into the stillness, like sand settling after a breeze has passed. Your thoughts drift, slow and warm, like honey dripping from a spoon. No rush, no need to chase anything. Just this, just now, just a quiet embrace of history, and cheese and dreams. Outside, the stars shine on, indifferent and eternal. The moon casts its silver glow over the desert. stretching shadows across dunes that have known no footsteps for centuries. Somewhere far away, a breeze stirs the tops of date palms, whispering secrets only the night can hear. And here, deep beneath the earth, you are safe, you are held, you are at rest. So let go, let your breath slow even more, let your mind soften, let your body sink deeper into this ancient hush. There is no hurry, no place to be, just the quiet, steady rhythm of your heart, beating slower now, softer, quieter, like the ticking of a clock lost in time, like the hush of a tomb that knows how to wait, like the gentle turning of stars above a sleeping world. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, dream softly, and may your journey, like the cheese beside you, last forever